My son-in-law handed me a cardboard box on a Tuesday morning and told me I had until Friday to clear out my room. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that stayed with me longest. How calm he was about it, the way you might tell someone the recycling goes out on Thursdays. He set the box on the bed, straightened up, and said my daughter and he had discussed it and they needed the space. Then he walked back down the hallway and I heard the television come on. I was 68 years old. I was standing in the bedroom of my late husband's house, the house we had paid off together, the house where I had planted the rose bushes along the back fence 20 years ago, the house that my husband Leonard had willed entirely to our daughter Abigail because, as his attorney explained afterward in a voice that managed to be both gentle and completely devastating, Leonard had believed a daughter would always take care of her mother. Leonard had believed a lot of things about Abigail that turned out not to be true. I sat down on the edge of the bed after my son-in-law left, and I looked at the cardboard box, and I thought about the 31 years I had spent as a registered nurse, and the 14 years after that as a home health case manager, and the fact that I had exactly $4, $200 in the checking account, and a 2009 Honda Civic that needed new brake pads. I thought about my sister Ruth in Phoenix, who was managing her own health problems and living in a one-bedroom apartment and who I could not call. I thought about my friend Diane, who had moved to be near her grandchildren in Vermont 2 years ago. I thought about all the places I was not. Then my son-in-law knocked on the door frame. He hadn't closed the door, I noticed, as if I might steal something, and told me that if I needed help lifting things, he could give me an hour on Saturday morning before his golf game. I said thank you. I don't know why I said thank you. Old habit, I suppose. 30 years of thanking doctors who barely looked at you teaches a woman to fill silences with whatever keeps the peace. I did not cry until I was in the Civic, parked at the end of the street with the engine running and the heat on, because it was March, and Cincinnati does not do anything gently in March. I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I drove to a diner on Montgomery Road and ordered coffee and a piece of pie I didn't want, and I sat in the booth by the window, and I tried to think clearly. What I knew, I had no place to go. The house had transferred to Abigail at Leonard's death 14 months ago, which meant it had never been mine, not legally, even though I had lived there for 23 years and repainted every room twice and nursed Leonard through 2 hip replacements and the cancer that finally took him. What I knew was that I was 68, that my nursing license was still current, but my body wasn't what it had been, that the job market for women my age was a particular kind of joke that nobody found funny. What I knew was that I had until Friday. The woman in the next booth was reading a paperback novel. The cook was singing something to himself behind the counter. Outside, a man was trying to parallel park a truck too large for the space he'd chosen, and he was going to be there a while. Everything was ordinary, and I was sitting in the middle of it with nowhere to sleep on Saturday. I found a room in an extended stay motel off I-71 for $190 a week. It smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's cooking, and the heating unit rattled through the night in a way that made sleep a negotiation. I paid for 2 weeks up front, and that left me $1,820, and I lay on the bed that first night with my hands folded on my chest like a woman in a painting, and I stared at the water stain on the ceiling, and I said out loud, to nobody, "All right, Nora, what now?" My name is Nora. I had not needed to remind myself of that in a long time. The next morning, I called Abigail. Not to beg, not to beg. I called because she was my daughter, and I thought, even then, that there might be some version of her that was embarrassed by what her husband had done, some version that would say it had gotten out of hand, that she was sorry, that of course I could stay in the guest room while I figured things out. She let it go to voicemail. I called again that afternoon. She picked up that time, and she was using the voice she used when she talked to difficult clients at work. Measured, a little distant, like she was reading from a script. She said she hoped I understood that this had been a very hard decision. She said they needed the room because her husband's mother was coming to stay. She said she was sure I would land on my feet because I always had. I had always landed on my feet. That was true. I had worked nights through Abigail's childhood so we could afford the neighborhood with a good school district. I had gone back for my case management certification at 53. I had cared for Leonard for 4 years while he declined and never once made her feel guilty for living her life. I'd always landed on my feet because there had never been anyone else to catch me, and I had understood that and made my peace with it. "Take care of yourself, Mom," she said, and hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. The heating unit rattled. A door slammed somewhere down the corridor. I thought about what it costs a person to become the kind of daughter who lets her mother go to a motel. Then I thought, I am 68 years old and I have 4 days left of paid nursing continuing education credits and an active license in the state of Ohio, and feeling sorry for myself is a luxury I cannot afford right now. I applied for 3 home health positions that week and followed up on 2. I registered with a nursing staffing agency that placed per diem shifts. I looked at studio apartments in neighborhoods I had never had reason to spend time in. I made a spreadsheet on my phone. I ate 2 meals a day from the gas station 2 blocks from the motel because it was cheaper than the diner, and the breakfast sandwiches were actually fine if you asked them to add hot sauce. On the Thursday of my second week, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Area code 513, Cincinnati. I almost let it go. I had been getting calls from extended warranty people with increasing frequency, as though the universe was compounding my problems, but something made me pick up. The woman on the line introduced herself as an attorney. She said her name was Miss Calloway. She asked if I was Nora Elaine Whitfield, formerly Nora Elaine Prentice, married to one James Douglas Prentice in Franklin County, Ohio, in 1977. I said I was. She said she needed to speak with me in person at my earliest convenience regarding the estate of James Douglas Prentice. I held the phone away from my face for a moment. James. I had not heard that name spoken aloud by a stranger in so long that it landed with a strange weight, like pressing on a bruise you'd forgotten was there. James Prentice had been my first husband. We had been young and foolish and married for 3 years, and then we hadn't been. And I had moved on and become Nora Whitfield and built the life I knew, and I had not thought of James in any sustained way in decades. I said I wasn't sure I understood. I said James and I had divorced in 1980. I said I hadn't spoken to the man in over 40 years. Miss Calloway said she understood that. She said this was precisely why she was calling. She said she would explain everything in person and ask if I could come to her office tomorrow morning. I said yes. I didn't have anywhere else to be. Her office was downtown, on the 14th floor of a building with a lobby that smelled like marble and ambition, the kind of lobby that makes you feel underdressed regardless of what you've worn. I had put on my good blazer, the navy one I kept for job interviews and funerals. Miss Calloway turned out to be a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the practiced calm of someone who regularly delivered complicated news to people who weren't prepared for it. She offered me coffee. I said yes, mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. She laid a folder on the desk between us. She explained that James Douglas Prentice had passed away 11 weeks ago in Dayton. He had never remarried. He had lived quietly, worked as a mechanical engineer for 30 years, retired, and spent the last decade of his life in a modest house outside Dayton with a garden and, apparently, a considerable amount of money he had never spent. She said he had left an estate valued at approximately $2.1 million. She said he had left the majority of it to me. I put my coffee cup down. I was careful about it, setting it exactly on the coaster. I said, "I'm sorry. To you." To me. Not to a charity, not to a distant relative, not to a neighbor who had looked after him. To me, his first wife, a woman he had not spoken to in 43 years. Miss Calloway had a letter. James had written it himself 2 years before he died and left it with his will. She passed it across the desk, and I read it there in her office, with the sounds of downtown Cincinnati 14 floors below and the coffee going cold beside me. He had written that he had never forgiven himself for the way our marriage ended, that the failure had been his drinking, his temper, his inability to be what I needed or what I deserved, that he had followed my life from a distance for a long time, not in any intrusive way. He wanted me to know that, but he had been aware that I had remarried and raised a family and made something good. He said he had been glad. He said he had been glad. He said when he learned Leonard had died, he had updated his will. He wrote, "I know this comes too late to matter in the way I once hoped it might, but I have more than I ever needed, and you were the best person I ever knew, and I would like you to have it, if you'll accept it." I read that sentence 3 times. The best person I ever knew? I thought about the motel room. I thought about the heating unit that rattled all night. I thought about Abigail's voice on the phone, measured and distant, telling me she was sure I'd land on my feet. Miss Calloway was watching me with the particular expression of someone who has learned to give people time. I said, "Is there a condition?" She said yes. To receive the estate, I would need to provide documentation confirming our original marriage and my identity as the named beneficiary, and I would need to appear at a probate hearing in Montgomery County within 90 days. I said, "That I can do." What I did not expect was James's half-sister. Her name was Vivian, and she had been 17 when James and I married, and she had, apparently, spent the intervening 4 decades nursing a version of the story in which I was the villain. I learned about her existence from Ms. Belt Calloway, who called me 10 days after our first meeting to let me know that Vivian had retained her own attorney and was contesting the will on the grounds that I had, according to her, abandoned James during a period of illness, and that the bequest represented a deathbed manipulation by someone who had re-entered James's life under false pretenses. I had not re-entered James's life at all. I'd been in a motel room off I-71 eating gas station breakfast sandwiches. James had made this decision entirely on his own. I said as much to Ms. Calloway. She said she believed me, and that documentation would be our friend. Vivian's attorney submitted a declaration to the probate court. In it, Vivian claimed that I had contacted James repeatedly in the years before his death, pressuring him to change his will. She claimed I had showed up at his home in Dayton uninvited on 2 occasions. She submitted what she described as copies of emails between James and a woman named Nora. Miss Calloway called me the evening she received the submission. She was quieter than usual. She said I should be aware that they were going to claim these emails existed. I told her I wanted to see them. When I did, I understood immediately. The emails were not from me. I have a particular way of writing. I have been told this my whole life by colleagues and friends alike, a specific rhythm to my sentences, the way I construct a thought. These emails were not that. They were close, but they were not mine. The phrasing was slightly off in ways that were hard to articulate and would be impossible to prove based on style alone. But the email address was wrong. The account used a variation of my name that I had never used anywhere, not on any platform, not in any form. I told Ms. Calloway. She went very still on the phone, the way people do when something shifts into a different category. She said, "Can you document that? Every email account you have ever used?" I had kept records. I have always been meticulous about records. 30 years of nursing will do that to you when you understand that what is written down is what happened and what isn't might as well not exist. I had records going back to 1997. I had never used that address, not once. Miss Calloway said, "Good. That's very good, Nora." The probate hearing was on a Wednesday in April in a courtroom in Dayton that was smaller than I expected and smelled faintly of old wood and radiator heat. I had driven up the night before and stayed in an inexpensive hotel near the courthouse. I had not slept well, but I had learned by then not to expect sleep before things that mattered. Vivienne was there. She was 71 now, a tall woman in a gray suit, and she sat at the opposing table, and she did not look at me once during the entire proceeding. Her attorney presented the emails with the gravity of someone producing a murder weapon. He read selections aloud. He described a pattern of manipulation and financial coercion. When it was our turn, Miss Calloway presented my documentation. Every email account I had ever created with registration dates and account histories. The address Vivienne's emails used had never existed in my records. Ms. Burse. Calloway then submitted a report from a forensic document examiner, someone who worked with metadata and server records, showing that the emails had been created from a single device and that the account had been registered 14 months ago, 2 years after the date on the most recent email header. Someone had created those emails recently and backdated them. The judge asked Vivienne's attorney if he wished to respond. He asked for a brief recess. When we resumed, the contest was withdrawn. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom afterward, and Ms. Calloway shook my hand, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet of the building, and I breathed. Just breathed. The kind of breathing you do when you have been holding something in your chest for so long that releasing it feels like a structural change. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this are supposed to end with triumph. What I felt was tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of the motel room, a tiredness that was the aftermath of having been afraid for a long time without realizing how afraid I had been. Then I drove back to Cincinnati, stopped for actual lunch at a real restaurant and ordered a turkey club and a glass of iced tea, and I let myself sit there for 45 minutes and not plan anything. The estate settled 6 weeks later. After attorney fees and Ohio estate taxes and the costs of the probate proceeding, I received $1,840,000. I know how that sounds. I know how these stories sound to people on the outside, the coincidence of it, the timing, a woman at her lowest point, and then a phone call, and then everything changes. I don't have an explanation for the timing that would satisfy a skeptic. What I have is the fact that James wrote that letter 2 years before I ended up in that motel room, before Leonard died. Probably before my marriage to Leonard was showing the cracks it was showing by the end. James had made his decision quietly, on his own, in a house in Dayton with a garden, and it had simply taken this long to reach me. The first thing I did was pay off my car. New brake pads, full service. Then I paid 3 months in advance at a decent apartment in Hyde Park with a second bedroom and a back porch where I could see a strip of sky between the buildings. I bought a new coffee maker and some plants. I paid a full year of health insurance without looking at the number more than once. I called Diane in Vermont. We talked for 2 hours. She cried a little. I told her I was all right. I meant it. Then I thought about what to do with the rest. I had worked in home health for 14 years, and I had seen what it looked like when elderly patients, mostly women, mostly alone, had no reliable support. I had watched women try to navigate a system that was not designed for them, that assumed they had family nearby, that penalized them for not having planned better for a situation no one had told them to plan for. I had watched them apologize for needing help. I had watched them thank people who were unkind to them because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't. I knew something about that now in a different way than I had before. I made some calls. I spoke with 2 social workers I had worked with over the years and trusted. I contacted a nonprofit in Cincinnati that provided transitional housing assistance for women over 60 who were facing housing instability, a thing that exists and is underfunded in ways that should embarrass a city of this size. I made a donation that was large enough that the director called me personally, and then I told her I didn't need recognition, I just needed her to use it well. I also set aside a specific amount for a woman named Cecilia. She had been my colleague for 11 years, the best wound care nurse I have ever worked with. And her husband had left her 3 years ago, and she'd been raising 2 grandchildren on a nurse's salary and fighting a car insurance dispute that had been dragging through small claims court for 8 months over $4,000. I called her and told her the dispute was over and the $4,000 was coming from me, and I wanted no discussion about it. She argued with me for 10 minutes and then cried and then argued some more, and I told her that's what we were doing and I would see her for lunch next week. I did not start a nonprofit. I did not give a speech. I did not, despite what several people in the stories I have read apparently do, take a watercolor class. I did start taking morning walks along the Ohio River Trail, which I had always meant to do and never had time for. The light on the water in the early morning is something I apparently needed to see and had simply not made time for. And now I had time, and I made it. There is a bakery near the trail that opens at 6:30. I know the man behind the counter by name now. He knows how I take my coffee. These are small things, and I have come to understand that small things done consistently are not small at all. Abigail has called twice since the estate settled. I didn't answer the first time. The second time I did, and I listened to what she had to say, and then I told her, very quietly, that I didn't have anything I needed from her right now. She sounded surprised. I think she expected me to be angry, or to want to talk things through, or to need her to feel guilty in a way she could then manage and move past. I didn't want any of that. I wasn't angry. I was simply somewhere else now. I told her I hoped she was well, and I meant it. Then I said goodbye, and I hung up. Leonard used to say that the thing about getting old was that you finally stopped having time for anything that didn't matter. I think I understood that at the time as a slightly gloomy observation. I understand it differently now. It's not gloomy. It's the truest kind of freedom there is. The kind that comes from having lost enough that you finally know the difference between what holds you up and what just takes up space. The apartment has good light in the mornings. The plants are doing well. I have a shelf of books I am working through, slowly, without obligation to finish any of them if they turn out not to be worth the time. I have Cecilia for lunch on the second Tuesday of every month, and she brings the grandchildren sometimes, and I have learned both their names and their opinions on various topics, and I find them genuinely interesting. I walked along the river this morning, and the water was that particular color it gets in early June when the light is still new and everything looks like it has just been decided. I bought my coffee. I stood at the railing and I looked out and I thought, I am 68 years old, and I am standing exactly where I am supposed to be. That is not a small thing either. I keep thinking about that cardboard box, the way my son-in-law set it down so carefully, so evenly, like it was nothing, like I was nothing, and I think about the woman who sat on the edge of that bed afterward and said thank you, not because she meant it, because she had spent a lifetime making herself small enough to fit in whatever space she was allowed. That woman was me, and for a long time I thought that was just who I was. But here is what I understand now. On the other side of all of it, the life you end up with is largely built from the choices you make when everything is telling you to give up. Not the dramatic choices, not the ones that make good stories at dinner parties, but the small daily ones. The choice to make a spreadsheet when you want to cry. The choice to answer the phone even when you're afraid of what's on the other end. The choice to keep your records, to document everything, to stay meticulous even when your hands are shaking. James kept his records too. 43 years of quiet, private accounting, not of money, but of something harder to quantify: what he had done wrong, what he owed, who he had been, and who he wished he had been instead. I don't think what he did was romantic. I think it was honest, and honesty conducted over 4 decades without any audience or reward is one of the rarest things a person can do. He could have let it go. Nobody would have known. He chose not to, and that choice reached me in a motel room off I-71 and changed the entire trajectory of what was left of my life. I think about Vivienne too, and I don't think about her with anger anymore. I think about what it costs a person to fabricate evidence, to construct a lie that elaborate, to spend that much energy trying to take something from someone you don't even know. She must have been so afraid. Fear is almost always what's underneath that kind of cruelty. Fear of being left with nothing, fear of being forgotten, fear of being the person who doesn't matter in the end. I had felt all of those things. I had just decided not to act from them. That is the only difference between Vivienne and me, I think. Not luck, not money, not the phone call from Ms. Calloway. The difference is that when I was afraid, I kept my hands clean and my records straight, and I let the truth do what I was too tired to do myself. Cecilia tells me I'm too hard on Abigail, maybe, but I've also stopped requiring myself to perform forgiveness on anyone else's timeline. Forgiveness, I've found, is something that happens in your own chest, quietly, when you're ready, not something you announce to the person who hurt you so they can feel better about it. I've let it arrive slowly. It's still arriving. What I know is this: I am 68 years old, I have a back porch and a good coffee maker, and a friend who argues with me for 10 minutes before accepting help, and the morning light on the Ohio River is genuinely something worth waking up for. I built none of this by being rescued. I built it by staying honest when it was inconvenient, staying sharp when I was exhausted, and staying standing when every reasonable person would have sat back down. The box is in the recycling now. I put my plants in the window instead.